Hi everyone, today is our lecture on the British Empire, which will end our Empire unit. So let's get started. So we'll start with a very famous phrase about the British Empire that kind of sets the tone for it. And the phrase is, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." Because if you look at all of the land that the British Empire owned over a 500-year period of time, 1497 and 1997, there's about 13 million square miles of territory overall, meaning that, as you can see on the map, they owned land in basically every part of the world. So no matter where the sun was shining, it was guaranteed to be shining on something that was considered British soil. So the most expansive empire of all time, and basically they at one point owned up to 1/4 of the world. 25% of all land was considered British soil. So let's talk about how they got there. So let's start in the beginning. 1497, you have King Henry VII, and he is going to join in on the new craze of discovering the New World. He's going to hire John Cabot, who you might remember from our explorer lessons, to discover a new route to Asia, which we all know didn't happen. Instead, he finds Canada. Now, if you know anything about Canada, it's a little cold. Today, when we have electric heat, back then, very cold when there really wasn't a lot of sources for mass migration. So instead, Canada is not really looked at for moving to live, but instead is looked at for a source of raw material, particularly timber, wood, because England at that point had basically been deforested, very little wood in the area. And also new furs, because there were a lot of new animals in Canada that didn't exist, particularly, remember, the beaver. Remember we talked about mercantilism? Yep, and those cottage industries. So you see this new wave of income that comes in to Britain because of the discovery and the claiming of Canada. About 80 years later, you'll have a new ruler on the throne, Queen Elizabeth I, and she's going to really look to strengthen and expand her empire. And she's going to do that by funding a lot of activity and expanding the British claim over the area in North America in the American colonies. Queen Elizabeth was very much into growing the power of her empire, and that's where you really start to see that super British empire come about because of all the funding she did for expansion, as well as supporting the products within her own country. Remember, she's the one who will help fund William Shakespeare and all of those type of arts endeavors to make sure everyone knows that Britain is the best. Shortly after her death in 1603 and 1604, you'll see the Treaty of London, which will end the Anglo-Spanish War. That's the war between England and Spain. And it's going to free the seas for travel. It's basically going to establish that concept that you can't own the ocean. That still exists today. If you know, you've heard of like international waters. Basically, any land owns about 3 miles out. And then after that, you're in international waters. And what that means, basically, you are free to travel throughout the ocean without worrying about running into Navy ships. You still got to worry about pirates, but Navy ships, you're okay. All right, so as they expand, you'll start to see these companies that begin making their money by trading goods. So you have the British East India Company, you'll have the Dutch East India Company, and a lot of fighting will happen because of that. There will actually be 3 Anglo-Dutch wars, which means war between England and the Netherlands, and that will happen in the 1600s. And then shortly after that, Britain wins, just so you know. Shortly after that, you will see them getting into a new fight, and this time with France, which is their favorite fighting buddy. In 1701, you'll see the War of Spanish Succession. Basically, who gets to be the new king of Spain after the king dies with no immediate heirs. The problem was because by that point, so many of the royal families had been married within the same family, lots of cousins. France had a claim and England had a claim, so they'll have a lot of fighting because of that, which will lead into eventually the 7 Years' War. That's what it's called in England. Does anyone know what we call it here? Because it did also take place in the American colonies. Yes, the French and Indian War. So it's the same war, just depending on where you were fighting is what you called it. And Britain will eventually win that war, and they'll get a lot of bounty from that, as well as a expansion of their shipping empire. Then you'll see fighting now happening in India. So Britain wants to expand into India because India is actually the place that everyone wants to get to. They are the land of spices. They are the ones that everyone was trying to get to originally when they found the New World. And you'll see a lot of fighting there. At that point, India is run by the Mughal Empire. So an Indian empire exists there, and both the British and the French want to connect with that empire. And you'll see a war between the British East India Company and the French India Company. And basically what will happen, unfortunately for India, is Britain will be tired of trying to make deals, so they're just going to invade in 1857, and they will take over and occupy India for the next 90 years. You won't see them gain their independence again until 1947. But with control of India, they now control the source as well as the shipping. So you can think of Amazon and their big warehouses. So they've now expanded their shipping. They would also like to expand their colonies. You have some wins and you have some losses. So you see exploration of the Pacific Ocean and finding new land there. In 1770, you'll see the discovery of Australia by James Cook, which most of you already know. Australia doesn't have a lot of really great things to trade. Lots of really interesting poisonous animals, but in terms of raw materials, there's not a lot that the world was clamoring for. So instead, they'll use it as a penal colony, meaning that if you were arrested in Britain and it was going to be a long-term jail sentence, they just shipped you to Australia, and they used it to store criminals who, after they served their time, would then just be released into Australia, and they probably would never make it home again. So that was Australia. You'll see the discovery of New Zealand shortly after that. However, the official colonizing of New Zealand will take much longer because there was a much greater united front by the Maori tribes that lived there. It is not until 1840 with the Treaty of Waitangi that Captain William Hobson and the Maori chiefs are able to sign a treaty allowing British people on the soil. It's a very interesting story because basically you have British soldiers with guns who are simply losing and losing repeatedly to the Maori tribe with just spears because they knew the land and they were able to fight well. And it wasn't until they actually just start sending a whole bunch of women and children as immigrants to basically just overrun the country. So that instead of sending warriors, they sent people who would either just be slaughtered, which was not the Maori way, or would just physically take over like squatters. And that's what happens. So, big wins in British terms on that one. You do have the loss of the American colonies in 1783, which we as Americans think as this big deal, but in terms of the British, it wasn't necessarily as big a loss as you would expect, because they did have a lot of territory in Canada as well as Africa and Asia, and now they had discovered a whole new continent with Australia. That's not to say that they didn't want it back. You do remember the War of 1812 also didn't go well for Britain, but you do see them fighting in many ways to expand their empire. And again, a lot of that fighting happens with France. Okay, so after the loss of the American colonies, you will see the Napoleonic Wars. Learning about Napoleon in our next unit. We'll learn about the French Revolution. But hopefully you already know who Napoleon is. But just for this point, he's the leader of the French Empire. He's going to try and expand the French Empire. He's going to try and take over Europe. And he's very successful for a period of time until he comes up against Britain, who's just tired of it. And they, again, today, much like with India, you know what, we're done with this. We're just going to destroy you. And you'll see that turning point in 1805 with the Trafalgar Battle. Basically, it was a naval battle, and back then, if you've seen any of the old pirate movies, like Pirates of the Caribbean, you know the ships line up facing each other, and then they put out their cannons, and they fire on each other, and whoever sinks first loses. Basically, what's going to happen in the Trafalgar Battle is the French will line up, and the British will not do that. You can see from the image, they are going to create two parallel lines, sorry, not parallel, perpendicular lines, math class, and they're actually going to split the French forces, and then they're going to sail through the French forces and circle around them, and then just fire inward to sink all their ships. And France is basically going to be like, that's not fair, you can't do that, that doesn't follow the rules of war. And Britain's going to be like, there's only one rule in war, to win, that's our rule. That's not really what they say, but that's basically the sentiment. And you'll see a lot of European countries backing them because they really didn't like the French who had just tried to take them over. So you will see them all joining together and following Britain into battle with France. And you'll see that final defeat in the Battle of Waterloo, where Britain is the great hero for leading the day. And that is going to mark the beginning of what's called Britain's imperial hegemony, which is basically the top of the empire, the best it can be, their absolute dominance over the world. So it is going to be a 100-year period, the imperial century of 1815 to 1914. Does anyone know what happens in 1914? Yes, World War I begins, so that's where it's all going to start going downhill. But for 100 years, they were doing very, very well. You'll see that more than 400 million people identified themselves as British citizens. In 1902, they'll establish the All Red Line, which was actually the name for the telegraph connection. You can see on the picture that's a telegraph. So going all the way back to when we talked about Rome and other empires and how they're connected with roads, and that makes you very successful. Here you don't need the roads, you just need communication. And that's what that red line did. It connected everyone in the British Empire to each other. You'll see the Opium Wars happening in the middle of this period, which is very, very good for Britain and very, very bad for China. The very short discussion of it is Britain basically became drug lords, and they snuck in a whole bunch of opium to try and cripple China, and that worked. And they agreed to stop providing drugs if China would start trading with them, because China didn't want to trade with anyone because they didn't need anything. So Britain was the evil mastermind in that case. When you get to the last decade of the 19th century, so the 1890s, you'll see more expanse into Africa. You'll see a second industrial revolution with even more technology happening and more money rolling in to Britain's empire. But all that is gold cannot last, and you'll see the world wars happening. World War I, you see an alliance system set up where Britain agrees to back France if anything should happen. Even though they used to hate each other 100 years ago, they agree to back them up. Same thing with Russia. And there's a whole fight. We'll get all into it in our War and Revolution unit, which is next after April break. But basically, the war will start. Britain declares war on Germany in 1914. Everyone gets involved in the war, all the countries, all the colonies. It will last 5 years. The Treaty of Versailles ends in 1919. And while Britain really is the main defense for most of that war, America would join in late 1917. It was in 1918. I'll have to look it up. What will happen is America gets a lot of prestige or glory for winning the war, even though Britain is the one that really really held its own. I'm trying to look for the date. It was 1918. Okay. So they had fought for 4 years without America's help. You have the Great Depression, which affects all of the world. It's not just an American thing. And then World War II will happen, 1939. Britain's going to declare war on Germany. They're basically the only ones who are fighting against Germany. France will declare war, but they'll be occupied very shortly after. The Soviet Union does not join in until 1941. In fact, in the beginning, they were working with Germany, and then they changed their mind for reasons we'll explain next unit. In 1941, you have the Atlantic Charter, designed to protect non-military ships, which is important, and it will eventually get America to join in. In 1941, you will also at the same time see Japan attack the United States, which means the United States will join in the war. Originally, we're just fighting Japan. We won't join the European fight until 1944. So from 1939 to 1944, again, Britain is fighting, for the most part, by themselves with resistance from the internal countries. So by 1945, when the war is over, Britain is crippled. They have spent all of their money. They have been physically destroyed because of bombings. And they're just not the hero, even though they really probably should be. Instead, we have Captain America taking over, and Britain loses almost all of their prestige. After World War II, a lot of people in upper levels agree that imperialism is really not good for the world because it makes everyone want to fight each other. So you see decolonization happening. Under the Cold War, you'll see this huge anti-colonial movement because, remember the Cold War, communism, that idea everyone's working together, that's also kind of similar to colonialism where, well, everyone's British, but you're not all British. 1947, you have India gaining their independence, as I already mentioned, losing that huge chunk of what was the British Empire. In 1982, Margaret Thatcher, who's the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, makes a negotiation with the Chinese government about the future of Hong Kong, which is a very famous city, the southern tip of China that was owned by the British Empire. She makes an agreement to work on trade, and 15 years later would release the ownership of Hong Kong to China. And that's exactly what happens in 1997. Hong Kong is returned to China. Even though Hong Kong did not want that. They didn't want to be British, but they didn't want to be Chinese either. They basically wanted to be their own country. So they're supposed to maintain their autonomy in the government, but that doesn't really happen either. And you'll see that considered the official end of the empire. So that's very interesting for how long it lasted and how recent it was. You most likely have someone in your house right now that was alive when the British Empire was still in existence. You all have a teacher who was alive. I was in high school when was I in high school? It was very early high school. I'm not that old. When the British Empire finally fell. Today, most British colonies are members of what's called the Commonwealth. The English language is the primary language of over 300 million people. And the parliamentary system is actually the most prevalent democratic government system, because when they released their colonies, instead of just dropping them like some other countries did, they actually stayed connected for a while to help them set up their government, so it would run very similar to Britain's government, which is why most democracies follow that today. So the last slide has a video for you. The guy's going to talk really fast, but it's a very good video to kind of show you the extent of the British Empire, and even though it doesn't exist today, you can still see all of those connections that still exist because of the expanse of the British Empire. Okay? So that's your lesson for today. The assignment is going to be an Empire Unit Review. It's not a quiz. It's a Google form that looks like a quiz, but it's not a quiz. You can use your notes, and it'll be due next class, which will be after April break. I hope you enjoy your April break. Take some time to relax, and I will hopefully see you soon. Bye.